A mafia family spent nearly 6 years trusting a man who was secretly working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He handled their business, traveled beside their captains, and listened as murders and internal disputes were discussed in front of him without hesitation. By July 1981, in New York City, members of the Bonanno family were preparing to formally induct him into the Mafia under the name Donnie Brasco. What they did not realize was that the organization had already been compromised from the inside. The weakness inside the Bonanno family. By the mid-1970s, the Bonanno crime family was no longer operating with the discipline that had once made it one of the most feared organizations in New York. Years of internal disputes had weakened its structure from the inside. Leadership conflicts, factional rivalries, and federal investigations were creating pressure the family could not fully control. Older bosses were losing authority, younger crews were becoming more reckless, and trust inside the organization was beginning to fracture. The instability had been building for years. In the 1960s, Joseph Bonanno's failed attempt to consolidate power against rival mafia leaders triggered what became known as the Bonanno War, a long internal conflict that damaged the family's reputation across the commission. By the time the 1970s arrived, the Bonannos were still carrying those scars. Informants, surveillance operations, and expanding federal racketeering cases were slowly forcing mafia families across New York to operate under growing paranoia. At the same time, the organization still depended on constant business activity to survive. Gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and labor rackets continued moving money through social clubs, bars, trucking routes, and storefront businesses across Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. That dependence on daily earning created a dangerous weakness. The Bonannos needed reliable people around them, and sometimes the pressure to earn mattered more than caution. That vulnerability created the exact opening Joseph Pistone would quietly step into. And once he entered their world, the line between outsider and insider began to disappear. Constructing Donnie Brasco, Joseph Pistone did not enter the Mafia through dramatic undercover stings or hidden recording devices. His approach was slower, quieter, and far more dangerous. In September 1976, he disappeared into New York under the identity of Donnie Brasco, a small-time jewel thief and hustler with connections in the street economy. Instead of forcing his way into organized crime, he made himself useful to it. He spent weeks studying the jewelry trade, so he could speak naturally around fences, bookmakers, and thieves who worked inside that world every day. He learned prices, terminology, repair methods, and resale practices, because even small mistakes could expose him. In mafia circles, people did not trust words alone, they trusted competence. Pistone moved through social clubs, bars, card games, and hijacking circles connected to the Colombo and Bonanno families. He loaned money, handled stolen jewelry, and participated in illegal gambling operations. Federal money quietly flowed through him into the hands of criminals who believed they were dealing with another street earner trying to climb upward. That was what made the operation so dangerous. Pistone was not pretending to understand organized crime from the outside. He was slowly becoming part of its economic structure. Men who had spent their lives around criminals stopped treating him like a visitor. They started introducing him to more connected people, bringing him into conversations that outsiders were never supposed to hear. And one of those introductions would eventually place him directly beside a Bonanno soldier named Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. If these real underworld stories interest you, subscribe and stay for the next file. The bureau that began financing organized crime. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was not a boss inside the Bonanno family, but he was respected, connected, and trusted enough to pull Joseph Pistone deeper into the organization's daily operations. Lefty believed Donnie Brasco was exactly the kind of street earner the Mafia valued: reliable, quiet, and capable of producing money. That trust slowly opened doors that federal investigators had never reached before. The Mafia operated through a strict earning structure. Associates kicked money upward to soldiers. Soldiers passed percentages to captains. Captains answered to leadership. Every gambling operation, hijacking crew, loan sharking network, and stolen goods operation fed into that system. Once Pistone became part of those activities, something extraordinary began happening behind the scenes. Federal money was quietly moving through the Bonanno hierarchy itself. The Bureau financed Pistone's cover identity, which meant the money he used in gambling circles, jewelry deals, and street operations often ended up in Mafia hands. Without realizing it, members of the Bonanno family were collecting earnings that originated from the government investigating them. At the same time, Pistone was observing how tribute moved upward, how disputes were settled, and which men controlled specific rackets across New York and Florida. The operation was no longer simply gathering names. It was exposing the economic structure of an entire crime family in real time. And while Pistone was learning how the Bonannos earned money, another part of the organization was quietly connecting itself to something far larger than traditional street crime. Carmine Galante, the Sicilian pipeline, and the family within the family. On July 12, 1979, Carmine Galante was assassinated at Joe and Mary's restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Photographs from the scene showed Galante still seated with a cigar in his mouth. The killing exposed a growing struggle inside the Bonanno family over narcotics trafficking, leadership, and control of international revenue streams. Galante had spent years strengthening relationships with Sicilian traffickers tied to heroin smuggling routes connecting Sicily to the United States. Many operated through pizza parlors, import businesses, and cash-heavy storefronts that appeared legitimate from the outside. Inside organized crime circles, these Sicilian-born operators were often referred to as the Zips. As Pistone moved deeper into Bonanno territory, he began hearing discussions tied to those narcotics operations and the growing influence of Sicilian networks inside New York. Federal investigations later connected many of those businesses to what became known as the Pizza Connection case, one of the largest heroin trafficking prosecutions in American history. At the same time, the Bonanno family itself was becoming increasingly unstable. Rival factions were maneuvering for power while distrust spread quietly through the organization, and in the middle of that instability, Pistone was about to move closer to one of the most powerful captains in the family, Sonny Black, and the expansion into real power. Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano was far more than a street-level operator inside the Bonanno family. By the late 1970s, he was an influential captain with serious standing inside the organization, respected for his earning ability, his loyalty, and his willingness to use violence when necessary. When Joseph Pistone moved into Sonny Black's crew, the Donnie Brasco operation crossed into territory the Federal Bureau of Investigation had never reached before. The relationship changed the scale of the infiltration almost immediately. Pistone was no longer sitting around low-level gambling circles or neighborhood card games. He was now around men involved in interstate rackets, stolen goods operations, illegal clubs, and discussions tied directly to leadership struggles inside the Bonanno family. In Florida, Sonny Black and Pistone operated out of the King's Court Bottle Club, a business front connected to gambling and other criminal activity moving between New York and Miami. At the same time, the Mafia's relationship with legitimate business became more visible to Pistone. Cash businesses provided cover for meetings, money movement, and illegal transactions that could blend into normal commercial activity. Political influence and labor connections quietly protected many of these operations from scrutiny. Organized crime was not functioning like a loose street gang. It was operating like a hidden commercial network spread across multiple states. But the deeper Pistone moved into Sonny Black's world, the more dangerous the operation became. Conversations about murders, retaliation, and internal discipline were becoming harder to avoid. And before long, the Bonanno family would begin discussing something even more dangerous, formally making Donnie Brasco one of their own. The Mafia was about to make an FBI agent. By the summer of 1981, Joseph Pistone had spent nearly 6 years inside organized crime under the identity of Donnie Brasco. He had earned money alongside Bonanno associates, traveled between New York and Florida, and built relationships with men who trusted him enough to discuss criminal operations openly in his presence. Inside the family, he was no longer viewed as an outsider trying to prove himself. He was being treated as someone who belonged there permanently. Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano had become one of Pistone's strongest supporters. Other members inside the organization were beginning to speak seriously about induction. In Mafia terms, becoming a made man was not symbolic. It meant formal membership, protection, and a permanent place inside the family structure. The Bonannos were preparing to swear loyalty to a federal agent without realizing it. The situation exposed something larger than a successful undercover operation. It revealed a dangerous institutional weakness inside the Mafia itself. A criminal organization built on secrecy, blood ties, and suspicion had allowed an outsider to move through its ranks for years without detection. Pistone had not forced his way inside through violence or manipulation alone. The Bonannos had gradually opened the door for him themselves. At the same time, the pressure surrounding the operation was becoming impossible to control. Pistone was being pulled into increasingly serious discussions involving murders and internal enforcement. Federal officials understood the risk was escalating rapidly, And the moment the Bureau finally decided to end the operation, the Bonanno family's internal collapse truly began. Exposure, executions, and the collapse of trust. On July 26, 1981, the Donnie Brasco operation finally came to an end. Members of the Bonanno family learned that the man they had trusted for nearly 6 years was not a loyal associate named Donnie Brasco, but Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Joseph Pistone. The revelation spread through organized crime circles across New York with shock and disbelief. What had happened was not viewed as a normal undercover success. Inside the Mafia, it was treated as a catastrophic security failure. The consequences began almost immediately. Suspicion spread through the Bonanno family as members tried to understand who had spoken too freely around Pistone and which operations had been compromised. Old loyalties became dangerous. Conversations were re-examined. Relationships that once brought protection suddenly became liabilities. Dominic "Sonny" Black Napolitano understood what exposure meant for him. According to testimony and law enforcement accounts, he was later killed by members of his own organization after being blamed for bringing Pistone too close to the family. Anthony Mira, another Bonanno associate connected to Pistone early in the operation, was also murdered. Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero avoided execution after federal agents arrested him before he could be summoned to a meeting believed to be connected to internal retaliation. The damage extended beyond individual killings. The Bonanno family became deeply humiliated within the national mafia structure. Other families saw the infiltration as proof that the Bonannos could no longer secure their own organization. And years later, that humiliation would reshape the family into something far colder and far more paranoid. Joseph Pistone and the Mafia. Rebuilt around fear, the Donnie Brasco operation permanently changed the Bonanno family. The infiltration created years of paranoia and distrust that continued long after Joseph Pistone disappeared from New York. Few people understood the damage more clearly than Joseph Pistone. Pistone eventually rose to become boss of the Bonanno family during the 1990s, but the lessons of the Brasco operation shaped how he rebuilt the organization. Meetings became more isolated. Sensitive discussions moved away from traditional social clubs. Members became increasingly cautious about surveillance, informants, and undercover agents. The family no longer trusted rapid advancement or easy access to leadership. The changes reflected a larger transformation happening across organized crime in the United States. Federal racketeering laws, electronic surveillance, and informants were forcing mafia organizations to become quieter and more defensive. Expansion itself had become dangerous. The Bonanno family's history, including the long-term impact of the Brasco infiltration and Pistone's later leadership, has been documented extensively in historical crime archives and organized crime records. Ironically, Pistone himself later became the first official boss of a New York mafia family to cooperate with federal authorities after his 2004 conviction. But by then, the Bonanno family had already spent decades living under the paranoia created by one undercover agent who nearly became a made man. The operation that changed the American mafia. The Donnie Brasco operation did not just produce arrests. It permanently changed how organized crime operated in the United States. Mafia families that once relied on open meetings, social clubs, and personal trust became quieter, more isolated, and far more suspicious. Joseph Pistone exposed a dangerous weakness inside organized crime. The larger the network became, the harder it was to control who moved inside it. The Bonanno family learned that lesson publicly, but every mafia organization in New York paid attention. Security tightened, communication changed, trust itself became a liability. Even decades later, the shadow of the operation remained. Pistone continued living under an assumed identity, while the Bonannos carried the paranoia created by one undercover agent who nearly became a made man. And perhaps that was the real damage Donnie Brasco caused. He did not just infiltrate the mafia. He forced it to fear its own structure. If you want more deep investigations into the hidden history behind organized crime, subscribe to Underworld Archives, because some of the most important parts of these stories never made it into the movies.